Hey everyone, I'm Sean Vincent Biggins, and welcome to the 11th episode of my quarantine-induced web series, Old T-Shirt Tuesday. It's great to be back here on the original set where it all started. So you may remember at the end of the last episode that in the fall of 1994, I took my first ever trip to California to visit my friends after having a pretty crappy year up until that point. It was a fun trip and just what I needed at the time. Well, fast forward to May of 1995 and my friends are ready to move back to Massachusetts. So that's where I come in. Chris wanted to drive back to Massachusetts, partly because he really wanted to do the cross-country drive, but also because he needed to get his car back to Massachusetts, which was a 1966 Ford Mustang in pretty decent condition. Danielle wanted to fly back, so the plan was I would fly out to California and do the cross-country road trip with Chris, and then Danielle would simply fly. Now, it's important to note that back then, a one-way flight would oftentimes cost more than a round-trip flight. Crazy, I know. So what we decided to do was something that just couldn't even happen now. Identity verification was not exactly a big priority for airlines back then, which was, of course, very pre-9/11. We simply bought a round-trip ticket under my name. I would fly to California using the first leg, and then Danielle would use my return ticket to fly back east. Back then, all they would ask you when you checked in was your last name. They didn't even check your ID most of the time. It seems insane now. The reservation simply had my first initial and last name on it. So when Danielle got to the airport, if anyone did check her ID and wonder why her name didn't match the one on the reservation, she would simply say that she had just gotten married and her ID hadn't been changed yet. Simple. I think she stayed a couple of extra days to tie up loose ends and stuff while Chris and I hit the road. But Chris made sure that we stopped for burgers at In-N-Out before we left California. That was my very first In-N-Out experience, and it was quite delicious. Now, I should remind you that Chris's car was a 1966 Ford Mustang in pretty decent shape. The one thing it did not have was a working radio. Someone had stolen it from his car fairly recently, so for the entire trip, it was going to be up to us to entertain each other. Chris also decided that he was going to do all the driving himself, because the car did have a few mechanical quirks that only he knew how to work through. That was fine by me. Our first stopover was Vegas. I had never been there before, and I'm not sure if Chris had either. So we looked for the cheapest hotel we could find, which I'm sure does not even exist anymore. The funny thing about Vegas is that no matter where you are, even if it's a crappy hotel, you're not more than spitting distance from slot machines. Well, we walked all around the Strip. We visited the classics like Caesar's Palace, but we also made sure to check out the newly built MGM Grand. Man, this thing was massive. I had never seen a hotel this big before. I think we played like one round of roulette and then hit the slot machines for the rest of the night. The important part was that we were getting free beer while we were playing. In total, I think I lost about $40, which was all I had been willing to lose when we walked in. The next day, we hit the road towards our next stop, Zion National Park in Utah. That place is so gorgeous. I had never seen rock that color before. I got a shot of this little guy while we were hiking in the park. We camped overnight. The next day would be a very long one. We were planning to drive from Zion, which is in southern Utah, to Denver, which is in central Colorado, about 600 miles away. Well, at some point shortly after crossing into Colorado, I fell asleep. It had been a nice, fairly warm, fairly sunny day up to that point. I was suddenly awakened by some noise, and when I opened my eyes, it was dark outside and my window was fogged up. After taking a moment to process things, I realized that what had woken me up was the sound of slush. More specifically, the sound of the car driving through slush, as well as the sound of a truck passing by us and blowing slush onto the car. I wiped off a foggy spot in the window and looked outside and said to Chris, "Is it snowing out?" He simply said, "Yep," as his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly and his eyes darted around from the windows to the mirrors to the road in front of us. We were in Vail Pass, Colorado, highest elevation over 10,000 feet. Chris was just trying to get his old Mustang up over that hill so we could look for a hotel. It felt a little harrowing in moments, but we did make it up over that hill and then found a lovely Super 8 motel shortly thereafter to spend the night. Needless to say, everything was covered with snow the next morning. Instead of heading into Denver, we tried entering Rocky Mountain National Park through the west entrance, but this road going in had already been blocked from previous snowstorms, so there's no way we were going to get in. And the only way to get to Denver would be to go completely around the park, which would have taken hours. So we just bit the bullet and headed north into Wyoming. As our elevation decreased, naturally the snow started disappearing, and we began to see these incredible wild landscapes and raging rivers. This is still one of my favorite landscape photos that I've ever taken. I can't say with certainty where this was. My best guess over the years, looking at maps, has been that it was somewhere along the Platte River. Well, we made our way into Wyoming and then headed east towards the capital city of Cheyenne. We turned north just as we were getting to Cheyenne, and we expected to see the usual signs of a city, but we couldn't really see much. It seemed pretty small to be a capital city. But there was also a sign saying that there was a Pizza Hut in that direction as well, so we figured if it has a Pizza Hut, it must be a real city, and that became kind of a running joke for the rest of the trip. We headed north. Our intended destination for the next day was going to be Mount Rushmore and Badlands National Park in South Dakota. Once it got dark, we found a campground in Wyoming, a little bit southwest of the South Dakota border. Looking at the map now, it seems to me that it was probably the Prairie View campgrounds that we stopped at. The couple running it were very friendly, but it was very cold and very windy. So putting up our tent was a challenge, to say the least, but we managed it. Hard to believe how toasty it got in my sleeping bag, considering how cold it was outside. Well, we got up the next morning and headed into South Dakota. Mount Rushmore was pretty packed with people, but it is an impressive thing to see in person. One attraction that had been advertised with billboards for miles and miles was this place called Wall Drug. So we just had to stop there before we got back on Interstate 90 to head east. We moved on to Badlands National Park, which is where I got this t-shirt. It was a cool and weird place to see. The things I had heard about it gave me the impression that this was a hot and dry place where desperados would hide from the law. But when we were there, it was cold and drizzling. It had actually started drizzling just before we entered the park. So we actually debated whether or not we should still go in, because it had been our intention to, explore the place on foot. We decided to go in anyway and make it more of a driving tour. At one point we stopped so I could get out of the car and take some photos. If you've never been to the Badlands, it's basically a bunch of mounds that are made out of clay and ash. It makes you feel like you're standing on the surface of another planet. But this clay and ash, if it gets wet from, say, drizzle, becomes immediately very slick. Well, I almost slipped and fell as soon as I stepped out of the car. I took some shots, we kept driving. As we got closer to the exit, the rain finally stopped, and so we thought, what the hell, let's get out and walk around a little bit. We tried taking our steps very carefully, and we were doing really well, until suddenly, in a spot that looked completely harmless, my feet slipped right out from under me, and I fell backwards and landed right on my ass. My coat and my camera bag were both covered with mud. I was relatively unhurt except for my pride, but we decided it was time to go back to the car. I actually changed my clothes by the side of the road, and fortunately no one else drove by while I was doing that. We got back on the road. And then once we were heading east, we started seeing signs for this place called the Corn Palace in Mitchell, South Dakota. An entire palace made out of corn? How could we not stop to see that? At some point when we were stopped in South Dakota, perhaps when we were near Wall Drug, I had stepped into this shop that sold antique firearms. My dad was a big Civil War buff, and they had this replica Civil War revolver with the U.S. holster. So I ended up buying this with him in mind. Well, we continued on our journey eastward. We camped at a KOA in the middle of Minnesota. We stopped a little bit to explore Milwaukee on our way to Chicago. That was sort of the museum section of our trip. Now, Chicago was the first and only place where Chris and I seemed to be getting on each other's nerves a little bit. I was taking too many photos at the Married with Children fountain, and Chris gave me some impatient ribbing about it, and I snapped back at him. Eventually, we got over it. We then headed into Indiana and then on to Cleveland, Ohio, and Chris and I each had a friend that lived there. That was the one and only time where we went our separate ways for the evening. I hung out with my friend, Chris hung out with his friend. I'm sure we needed the break. After that, we stopped along Lake Erie on our way to Niagara Falls, which I had just been to for the first time the year before with a female friend. You may remember that story from the last episode. After that, our final night on the road was in Syracuse, New York. We simply drank beer and watched Dumb and Dumber on the TV in the hotel room. The next day, we arrived back in the Boston area. Chris dropped me off at home, and then he went home himself. Less than 2 months later, Chris and Danielle got married in Salem, Massachusetts, which is actually where my mom's from. It was a great road trip. We got to experience so many new places. We didn't kill each other after a week and a half stuck in a car together with no radio, and we're still best friends today. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.